Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. of Reformed GGA. I also run the Relationship and Truth YouTube channel for those of you who watch that. And today I'm going to be doing a review of one of my favorite guns, the X95 Tavor X95 9mm. Before we get to that though, I would like to discuss something that people do ask about. And a lot of people have noticed on my channel that very frequently, I talk about gun stuff of course, but on a lot of my videos, I'll also talk about things from the Bible. And people wonder why sometimes, you know. In our society, when it comes to various forms of political activism and those kinds of things, we oftentimes separate things out as much as we can. And there are a lot of people who are Second Amendment advocates like I am, who take their Second Amendment advocacy and they put it over here, and then the other aspects of the life they try to separate from that as much as possible. Tim from Military Arms channel is definitely like that. He doesn't do an awesome job of that sometimes, which I'm actually happy about. But for the most part, he tries to keep Second Amendment stuff over here, and then everything else is kind of kept back. And it's because he doesn't want those other things to interfere with his Second Amendment advocacy. But if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know that that's definitely not how I do things. Instead, I'm always talking about things from the Bible, and I'm talking about the moral standard of the Bible and the kinds of things that Christians believe about self-defense and all these things. And so the question comes up, well, why don't you make a distinction? Why don't you do even what some people who would call themselves Christians do in dividing the areas of your life out? You know, keep the church stuff at church, and then your political activism and all that, do that on its own. Why bring the two together like that? And the answer is very simple. I'm a Reformed Christian, and because I'm a Reformed Christian, I am also a biblical Christian in the most thorough sense of the word. And I'm not saying that I'm perfect in following the Bible. That's not what I mean by that. What I'm saying is that Reformed Christians hold as their supreme standard the Bible, Holy Scripture, the canonical scriptures. That is our supreme standard. And so what it says is what goes. We consider it to be the word of the living God, the only true God. And when God says something, the matter is settled. And so if he says you're supposed to live your life in a particular way, that's what you're supposed to do. And one of the most basic biblical commands, a lot of people don't like, and a lot of people who call themselves Christians don't follow, but one of the most basic biblical commands reads like this. There's a command in the Bible that says you are to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might, and with all of your strength. This is the first and greatest commandment. This is what Jesus said in the New Testament, and when he said that, he was actually quoting the Old Testament. He wasn't introducing anything new. That wasn't a new commandment. That was an old commandment. In fact, that was one of the very first commandments that was given. It was a commandment that was given in a part of the Bible called the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, the very first part of the Bible that was ever canonized. That's how old of a command this is. And this is the one that Christ, when asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? This is the one he responds with. Love the Lord your God with all of your might, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, with all of your mind. Every single thing that you have belongs to God. If you are a person of God in the biblical sense, I'm not just saying someone who merely calls themselves a Christian, because there's lots of people in society who call themselves Christians, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately just because it's done so much to absolutely ruin the term. People call themselves Christians, and you start wondering, you know, if the original Christians historically would actually recognize these people as being fellow Christians, and in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, I don't think they would, to be quite frankly honest, because they don't believe the things that the early Christians believed. And what the early Christians believed, we have recorded for us in the pages of Scripture. That's what Scripture is. It's the first and most authoritative sources of the faith. There's no getting around it or behind it. This is the earliest, most authoritative set of records that we have. And so you can, you know, surmise about things all day long, but this is the actual record. This is what they believed and taught. And what they believed and taught is that if you're going to become a person of God, if you are going to apply this moniker to yourself, then this is the kind of life that you're going to strive to live. Not that we ever live perfectly, unfortunately, but this is the goal. You are to live in such a way that people are going to see that you want to love the Lord your God with all that you are, all of your might, all your strength, your soul, your mind, everything that you have is going to God. And the term that is used there is that key operative term, all. That's the key condition that's put on these things. It's not some of it. It's not, well, in religious matters, do the godly thing. It's all. Your entire life, both the quote-unquote religious and the quote-unquote secular things, all belong to God. So for myself, as a Reformed Christian, a thoroughly biblical Christian, and I'm not saying that to be arrogant or anything like that, just saying that when the Bible says something for us as Reformed Christians, that is the standard. We cannot go against that and be true to our religion at the same time. The Bible says you are to love God with everything that you are, with all of your heart. Not just your religious heart and then your secular heart can go off and do whatever it wants. With all of your mind. Not just your religious mind and your secular mind can go off and do and believe whatever it wants to believe. No. Every aspect of who you are is to be devoted to God, is to love God, to serve God, to bow in submission to Him. Every single part of who you are. And so the reason why I talk about these things on my channel is because that is what I am commanded to do. And for me, as a biblical Christian, I don't consider that to be any kind of chore or anything like that. When I get the opportunity to talk about these things on video with you guys, I'm not sitting there going, well, to be a good Christian, I got to make sure that I mention the Bible at least once. No, this is my pleasure and this is my joy. I love my God and I love talking about my God. Okay, I love talking about the one who is the one true King of the universe, who has no equal or parallel. I love talking about that God. Okay. But it is still a commandment. It is a commandment that can only be obeyed from the heart, but it's still a command. It's not an option. It's not like, if you get around to it, love me with all you are. No, it's still a command. And yes, the God of the Bible does command love. And that is a strange concept for a lot of Westerners. They don't understand that love can be commanded. To them, it's just such a foreign concept. And a lot of Western Christians, a lot of American Christians, they would flat out look at you and say, I don't believe in that God. And well, okay, that's nice, but what you've basically said is you don't believe in the God of the Bible, because that is the God of the Bible who said that, who commanded, and Jesus Christ even says that it's command. He's asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, love the Lord your God, and it's in the imperative mode. It is a command. Love the Lord your God with all of your hearts, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, all, and love. And it's a command. It's an imperative. But like I said, for a child of God, that commandment isn't harsh. It's what we want to do. And it's something that we cannot abandon. Even if it might serve our purposes in other areas, to be a Second Amendment advocate, if I wasn't doing all these other things, it'd be a lot easier. And frankly, I'd have a larger YouTube channel. A lot of people would want to listen to it if I just got into the gun stuff and I didn't worry about all this other stuff. But by heart, by what I love, I can't do that. And then also by commandment, I can't do that either. My God commands that everything that I do be devoted to Him. And my response to His love for what He's done in my life. And I'm not saying in terms of practical things, He's made me understand real estate so much better. No, He's made me love my children more. I don't have any children. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying about the fact that I am a vile wretch in and of myself, and that without God I am absolutely nothing, and that I came to realize that. And that's true of everyone. The only difference is whether or not they realize that, and they bow before Him as Lord in response to that, in humble submission and repentance. I did do that by His grace, of course. Not because it was in me, but because he showed me who I am when I was not willing to see who I was, and offered his grace to me. And the natural response of my heart is in that is to love the things that he loves. I'm not saying that my heart is perfect. While still in this mortal life, we still deal with the effects of the fall and what the fall has done to our very souls. But the idea that I would have a YouTube channel about guns and I would never talk about God in it is something that I just cannot fathom. I can't. That I am a part of the people of God, and I cannot live in any other way. I know there's lots of YouTube channels where they just do the Second Amendment thing and they don't really talk about anything else. But for a Reformed Christian such as myself, we just don't have that option. By dint of our passion towards God and also by the commandments that God has given us, we don't separate parts of our life out like that. It's not, you do the religious thing on Sunday and then the rest of your life you do whatever. That's not us. For us, every single thing that we do, mostly because we can't help it in a lot of ways, every single thing that we do is a part of our religious life. And that includes Second Amendment advocacy. And what we do in saying that, yes, the people should have access to arms because God gives people the right to self-defense. And like I said, it's all interconnected for us. We cannot be Second Amendment advocates without being Christians. The reason why we're Second Amendment advocates is because we're Christians, because God both provides the principle of self-defense in the Bible, and he also provides the positive encouragement for societies to promote self-defense. He is also a God who promotes justice and who promotes fights against injustice. And frankly, it's a whole lot easier to fight injustice with a gun than without. Just being brutally honest there. Because of all those things, I am an advocate of these things. And frankly, in and of myself, for the longest time, I wasn't a Second Amendment advocate. And frankly, in those periods of my life, before relatively recently, I was much more secularly minded. If it wasn't for the fact that I was a Reformed Christian, I don't know that I actually would have become a Second Amendment advocate. I honestly don't think I would have. For me, like I said, it's all a package deal. It all comes together. I cannot imagine one part of my life without the other. I just can't. So when people ask, why do you have this channel where you mention all this God stuff all the time? Just get into the guns. Just get into the review. Stop making us listen to the Bible. Well, you can go and listen to other channels if you want to. But if you're like me, you understand that one aspect of your life is going to wind up having an impact on the other, whether you want to admit it or not. If you're an atheist, that atheism is going to come out in the things that you believe one way or another. One aspect of who you are, your atheism, is going to have a bearing on other things that you believe. Whether you want to admit it or not, it is. They're connected. And the same thing for myself as a Reformed Christian. My morals, my religious beliefs, if you want to say, my ethics, are going to have a bearing on the things that I'm going to support in society. No freaking duh. We all have biases, and our biases stem from our core beliefs. And the question is whether or not you're going to admit that and actually discuss that, or you're going to try to put it on the back shelf and pretend that you're neutral and you're just stating facts about the right to keep and bear arms and whatnot. Nobody is truly neutral. The question is whether or not they're actually going to admit it. And also whether or not we're going to give people due consideration in listening to all that they might have to say to us and want us to think about. Or are we just here for the guns? If you're just here for the guns, yeah, this is probably not the YouTube channel for you. But if you're interested in an entire life philosophy, not just related to the Second Amendment, but other things as well, as it relates to the Second Amendment perhaps, and what Reformed Christians believe as it comes to all of these things, then yeah, this might just be the YouTube channel for you. But am I going to stop talking about Bible stuff in my reviews anytime soon? Nope. And with that said, let's go ahead and get into the actual review of the X94 Tavor in 9mm. Now, those of you who are very astute will notice the wardrobe change. That's because I did this review over a couple of days. However, hopefully that will not affect the outcome of the review any. So let's go ahead and talk about kind of the history of the X95 Tavor just a little bit. The X95 Tavor, as probably a lot of you know, started out as a military weapon. This is made by IWI, Israel Weapon Industries, and this is a civilian version of a military grade weapon. The military weapon was a bullpup like this one, and for those of you who don't know what a bullpup is a gun where they've taken the controls and they've basically moved them forward. On most guns, the controls are actually going to be behind the ejection port. When you're talking rifles, that's usually where the controls are. They're usually just under the ejection port and those kinds of things. So the control would normally be back here, and then you'd have the button and everything else sticking off behind the gun. But on bullpups, what they do is they take the control group and they actually move it underneath the barrel in front of the actual action of the gun. So it's actually in front of the bolt instead of just to the rear of the bolt. And you might say, well, how does that work? Well, the simple answer is transfer bars. So they still have an action system back here like you would on any gun. In fact, these two little pins that you can see right here are where the sear mechanism that has the hammer in it is located. So the sear is still in the same place, the hammer is still basically in the same place, but the controls that operate that are way up here, and there's little transfer bars that run from the front of the gun, well, this is kind of the middle of the gun, back to the action. And the advantage of that is that it allows you to make the gun much smaller. This gun is basically as small as you can get in America, and it still be something that you don't have to fill out too terribly much paperwork for. This still meets the standard legal definition of a rifle in America for civilians. A rifle that civilians are allowed to buy new in America, the basic requirements, there's actually quite a few things that go into it, but basic requirements are that the barrel has to be, sorry for the noise in the background, can't control that, but the basic requirements are that the barrel has to be at least 16 inches long, but of course that is from the bolt to the end of the barrel, not the muzzle brake, but to the end of the barrel, unless the muzzle brake is actually pinned in, but on a lot of them they don't do that, so it's just to the end of the barrel, not the flash suppressor or the muzzle brake or whatever you got on there. So from basically the front of the bolt to the end of the barrel, but not to the end of the flash suppressor. And by the way, I already safety checked this, so don't freak out about me muzzling myself there. Okay, safe gun, it is. Okay, so you have to have at least a 16-inch barrel, and then the overall length of the gun has to be at least 26 inches. The X95 Tavor, because they move the action forward underneath the barrel, what they're able to do is make something that, with this pad on the back here, meets the minimum length requirements. Technically, I think it's like 26 inches or something like that instead of the minimum of 26. They go a little bit past that just to make sure that they're safe. And then the barrel on it is 16 point some odd inches. It's like 16.5 inches instead of just 16. They go a little bit more just to make sure that they're in the green legally. But this is pretty much as small a gun as you can get in American as a civilian. So it has to be no less than 26 inches long, and the barrel has to be at least 16 inches long. And this is about as close as you're going to get. Oh, and then of course you're not allowed to buy new full automatics, and so this one is just a semi-auto. And that's basically where this thing comes from. Originally an Israeli weapon that had the Bullpup design, but the original Israeli weapon was of course fully automatic, and it was actually even shorter than this thing is. The military doesn't have the same restrictions that civilians do, and especially the military in Israel doesn't have the same kind of restrictions that American civilians do. And so the guns are actually not exactly the same. This one is bigger than what the Israelis carry, and this one's semi-auto instead of full auto. And so this one's bigger, heavier, and doesn't shoot as fast. But other than that, the design is basically the same. And from that standpoint, something that was made for the American civilian market, basically just to meet all the laws that you could and still have as small a package as possible, it does a really good job at that. And this is actually what attracted me to bullpups in the first place. Now, bullpups have lots of disadvantages, and those disadvantages are myriad. But the greatest advantage of them is just the short overall package that you have while still having a full-length barrel. So you can still have all the ballistic performance that the longer barrel will give you, but you have something that's short and very maneuverable. And when I was first buying this thing, that's what really attracted me to the Bullpup design. Most of the time, I live in apartments. And when I'm not in apartments, I'm usually in a hotel room somewhere. Now, this thing usually doesn't travel with me. There are exceptions to that. But usually it doesn't travel with me. And that's just because this thing's, almost 30 inches long. And a lot of times my suitcase isn't quite that long, especially when you consider putting this in some kind of a lockable case, which I always suggest that you do if you're going to be traveling. The lockable case that this thing would fit in is going to be all of 30 inches because you have to leave a little bit of room on either side for the case. And so it winds up being about 30 inches, and most of your standard suitcases are going to be like 29 inches or less. And so this thing's just a little bit too big to make a good travel gun. There are ways to do it, but it's usually not super convenient. But given that I'm in an apartment, and apartments are, a lot of my apartments that I've stayed in at least, are fairly close quarters, usually have weird angles in them, and just overall, they're not great places to use long guns. Well, this one has a lot of the performance features of a long gun, except it's really short. So, I mean, like a normal rifle, I can get two hands on it, I can shoulder it, I can get a cheek well on there, I've got 4 points of contact, and so I'm going to be able to aim relatively quickly. And that's what I like about the rifle design. I'm much more accurate with the rifle than I am with a handgun, and that's true of most people, especially with me because I'm recoil sensitive. But yeah, far more accurate with something like this. And given that it's so small, I can move around any corner in my apartment and it not be a major issue at all. And so that's why I went with the Bullpup design. And then I also went with 9mm, and that one takes a little bit more explaining. At the time, I was under the, turns out, wrong impression that pistol caliber rounds had less overpenetration risk than rifle rounds. And as a blanket statement, that actually turns out not to be true. At the time I thought, well, it's a less powerful round, so less overpenetration. Not necessarily. With certain comparisons that holds, like if you're comparing a 50 BMG to a 9mm round, yeah, the 50 BMG is likely to penetrate more than the 9mm round will. But if you scale that back as far as rifle rounds are concerned and go to intermediate cartridges like 5.56 NATO, 5.45 by 39, the Russian intermediate cartridge, or at least one of them, even 300 Blackout, if you get it going at a sufficient speed and a fairly delicate bullet, will actually produce less overpenetration risk. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive. You have a more powerful bullet than the pistol caliber round, but it penetrates less. What's going on there? Well, with rifle calibers, of course, you have a lot more energy. And if you're talking about intermediate cartridges, they're fairly small bullets and usually fairly delicate bullets. And so something that's very light, moving very fast, has the habit of dumping its energy upon entering pretty much any medium. And so they don't tend to penetrate as much as something that is going to retain its energy. Pistol rounds are basically the opposite. Pistol rounds typically are heavier than intermediate rifle cartridges are. For example, a 9mm, a basic 9mm round will be about 115 grains. Compare that to a standard 5.56 round, which is usually around 55, usually not much, usually not above 77 grains, but 55 grains for basic target ammo. So you have, in the 9mm, you have a heavier bullet. It's 115 grains. It's also a larger diameter than the intermediate rifle cartridge, and it's also moving much more slowly. And slower projectiles that are heavier tend to maintain their momentum better. Instead of dumping all of their energy in the medium, they keep their energy and tend to push through the medium. So pistol rounds punch holes in targets. Rifle caliber rounds, on the other hand, especially intermediate ones, just tend to more or less explode in the target and just deliver all kinds of energy, and that's what makes rifle rounds so much more effective, especially intermediate ones, given at least in a bang for your buck kind of sense, and given the size of the round and how much powder you have, etc., etc. And so as far as over-penetration is concerned, pistol rounds are actually more of a risk than intermediate rifle cartridges are. At the time, I didn't know that. And so at the time, I thought, hey, I'm living in an apartment, something that's not going to over-penetrate as much is a good thing. So, hey, small bullets ought to penetrate less, so I'm being safer. Turns out that wasn't true. So part of my reasoning for getting this thing was off. But the rest of my reasoning behind it was valid. It is it's a relatively small gun, especially for a rifle. It is literally about as small as you can get legally in the United States without having to fill out special ATF paperwork and all those kinds of things. Just standard import, go and buy it with a standard background check and not have to do all the extra paperwork and the $200 stamp and all those things. Shy of having to do all that, this is about as small as you're going to get. So that part remains true. And then another thing that's nice about it is that since this has a full-length barrel on it, you do get added performance out of the round, especially compared to something that would be shorter. So if you're talking about 9mm, which is what this has been one that's chambered in 9mm. The difference that you get in velocity is usually fairly significant. Now, people debate exactly how long the barrel is going to be to get added performance, and at what point you start decreasing performance. Because if you get a barrel too long, all the powder will have burned, but you still have barrel, which means you're still adding friction, and so too long of a barrel will actually slow you down. But as long as your barrel is relatively short, adding more barrel actually helps. Out of a really, really short barrel, the powder that's in the cartridge, not all of it will burn. But if you lengthen the barrel a little bit, you give the powder more of a chance to burn, and the more powder that burns, the more energy is being produced. The more energy that's being produced, the faster the bullet is going to go. And what I found with these ones, in general, I'm speaking of 9mm carbines in general, most 9mm carbines have a barrel length of around 16 inches because that's what the federal minimum is, and so that's kind of what they have to do. And what I found is that for the lighter ammo, the 115 grain, is that you can usually get an increase of about 18% in velocity. And you figure that out, that winds up being a difference of about 39% in muzzle energy. And the reason why it's not exactly proportional is because muzzle energy follows the square of velocity. So it's basically taking the velocity, multiplying by itself, and that's what transfers into energy. There's also a component for the mass of the bullet. But kinetic energy is basically mass times velocity squared. And so you increase the velocity, sometimes not by a whole lot. You can actually increase the energy by a good deal. And so this one over a standard pistol is going to give you quite a bit more energy. Usually somewhere at least 50 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, if not a full 100. And so it does make whatever you're firing more effective. Since you can get two hands on it and you can shoulder it and you can get a cheek well on there, it's going to make it more accurate for you. So you're more accurate with it. The round itself is going to be leaving at higher velocity, so it's going to deliver that much more power on target. Not that 9mm is super high, but that much more on target. My thinking in that regard was great. And then the other major thing is that I wanted something that would be relatively cheap to shoot, but still reliable. Rimfire is really cheap to shoot. You know, 22LR especially is really cheap to shoot. You can get some of the bulk pack stuff for like 5 cents a round, and most of the time, even relatively good 22LR ammo won't usually be more than 10 cents a round. But the problem with rimfire that I've talked about in the past is that rimfire is not overly reliable. Either the cartridges themselves or the guns that fire them, especially if you're talking a semi-auto, not great in the reliability aspect. So if you want something that's more reliable, you usually have to step up to a centerfire cartridge. And as far as centerfire cartridges are concerned, the cheapest one, at least one of the cheapest ones, and it usually does wind up being the cheapest, is 9mm. So it is, for something that's fairly reliable, it's about the cheapest you're going to be able to shoot for. In my area, I can get aluminum case ammo for under 20 cents a round. That's not including tax. And then for brass case ammo, it's usually sitting somewhere between 24 to 26 cents a round. And comparing that to most other centerfire cartridges out there that are either pistol or rifle, it winds up being cheaper than most of them, especially in my area. For example, the 5.56 rifle round in my area is at its cheapest right now about 28 cents a round. And so there's usually around a 4-cent difference per round in the cost of the two. Now 5.56 is a whole lot more effective than 9mm is, that's certainly true. But just in a basic, is it reliable, how cheap can I shoot it sense, both 9mm and 5.56 are very reliable in general. Both centerfire rounds going to be pretty reliable in that sense. And then as far as cheap to shoot, the 9mm is indeed cheaper to shoot by, like I said, usually at least 4 cents in most cases, 4 cents per round. So when I originally bought it, I wanted something that was going to be relatively small so that I could work inside of an apartment with it as a bedside gun, something that I could of course be very accurate with, something that I could get two hands on, shoulder, put a cheek well on there. Much more accurate than I am with a handgun, fits that role. And then something that's relatively inexpensive to shoot, but still reliable. 9mm does a good job at that. The thing that I got wrong though is that I thought that it would have less over-penetration risk. Turns out that's not true. Now there are rounds that you can get for 9mm that will decrease your over-penetration risk, and I do use those. But it turns out that a conventional rifle round, as long as it's an intermediate cartridge, can actually do better in that regard. So that's kind of why I got it. And overall, I have really loved this thing. It has been an awesome gun for me, very reliable gun, and all in all, it does exactly what I wanted it to do. Now, it is kind of an expensive gun in my area. These things usually go for somewhere between $1,500 and $1,900. So they're not cheap. And what you're paying for is the reliability. IWI, pretty much all the stuff that they make is pretty reliable. So you're paying for reliability, and you're also paying for the fact that it is just so small compared to most conventional rifles. But like I said, that doesn't make them necessarily better than a conventional rifle. Bullpups have lots of disadvantages. Because there's a transfer bar mechanism that goes from the trigger pack to the action in the back, there's going to be kind kind of a feeling of disconnectedness that you don't have with conventional rifles. The trigger pull on them is usually not over good. It's usually pretty heavy for most bullpups in general. Very few exceptions to that. They tend to have a heavier trigger pull, and because there's that transfer bar in there, it tends to be just a little loose. It's hard to get a real good trigger pull on them just because it kind of wiggles around a little bit, to be honest. And so the trigger pull on them isn't great. Now this trigger is improved over kind of the original Tavor that was entered into the US market. The original Tavor entered into the US market was the SAR. This is the X95. And the SAR definitely had a terrible trigger. It was not fun at all. This one is a little bit better, but it's still not great. And I don't know exactly what the old one pulled at versus this one, but I can say, at least subjectively, this one is better. They did that right, but it's still not great. Another issue with bullpups is that they're usually not all that great at range. They're not overly accurate, and part of the fact is just because of how they build them. They tend to have lots of internal contact with the barrel, sometimes weird barrel harmonics and all kinds of things that just take away the overall accuracy. Even in true rifle versions of them, you usually don't expect anything better than about 3 MOA. That's usually considered pretty good for a bullpup. So, you know, in practical usage, especially with relatively cheap ammo, 3 to 5 MOA is fairly normal. So is this something that you're going to be, you know, using at any considerable range to get your prize elk from 600 yards? No, especially in 9mm, but even if it was a rifle version, not really. It's not what they were designed for. They were designed to be small, compact, and something that could work in tight spaces, but they're not distance guns by any stretch of the imagination. That's just not what they were really meant for. So that's a disadvantage. And then another thing about this gun that I personally don't like is the bolt release slash bolt stop. It's this little lever here at the back of the gun. I don't know how well you can see it, pulling on it there. But using it as an actual bolt stop and manually operating it that way is very difficult. To do it, I have to grab the charging handle, which is up here, pull it back, and you'll notice I'm just pushing it against my chest, then pull down on the bolt, and then hope that the bolt catches, and it doesn't always. Like that, catch. Okay, that time it did. But just kind of a finicky bolt, and so manually holding it open. Now when the magazine is in it and you get to the end of the magazine, it holds open just fine. But manually running it, like I said, I have to put it center chest, run the charging handle while gripping this thing down here, trying to pull it out and manipulate it. It's not easy to use as a manual bolt stop. Not convenient at all. And then another thing with the place where it's located, being down there at the bottom, that thing is really easy to bump, and I cannot tell you how many times after I fired my last round, the bolt locks back, the bolt release button comes down, and just in sometimes even just setting it down on a table, I'll wind up accidentally hitting that button, you know, and take the magazine out and then go to set it down and just tap the end of the stock on the table, and that's enough to set off that bolt release. And it's meant to be easy to hit, but it's a little too easy, and it's on the back end of the gun, which is where your body is, which is where your arm is, and depending on how you set it down on things, sometimes it's the first thing to make contact. I'm going to manually release it there, but I do not like the bolt release on this thing. And what I've taken to doing is just as soon as the gun's empty, just, you know, emptying the magazine and going in, hitting the bolt release, just so that it doesn't wind up becoming a problem later on. Because if you happen to be working in the chamber area and you have your fingers in there and you accidentally hit the bolt release, that doesn't feel good, just saying. That's kind of a liability. So for me, what I found is closing the gun back up as soon as possible is usually the safest thing to do. Yeah, I do not like the bolt release down there. But as far as other controls that are on the gun, it's actually fairly standard. If you're used to the AR-15 platform and a lot of Western rifles in general, it'll actually be pretty natural to you. So of course you have the the trigger, and right above the trigger you have the magazine release. That's what that button is. Magazine release is over there, and it does turn out that that is ambidextrous. There is a magazine release button on the other side, so if you wanted to hold it with your offhand like this, which would be kind of weird, but for the smaller versions that the military actually uses, you'll get people that'll have a hand basically on the foregrip, and then with their thumb they can go ahead and hit it, and you'll see people that'll run it like that, and that works. And there is another advantage in it, and these guns can be converted to left-hand use relatively easily. Definitely not field swappable, but you can trade them out to left-hand usage pretty easily. And on the reverse side, you'll see the what is that called? You'll see a cover for the chamber area, and this could actually be taken off and swapped to the other side and things like that. You will have to convert out the bolts and those kinds of things. Some of the bolts you can actually take the bolt apart and change it over to left-hand configuration. On some of the X95s, depending on which caliber you're doing, sometimes you need to get a brand new bolt. I'll talk about that in a second. But as far as controls, fairly standard controls. So trigger's same place. Magazine release is basically in the same place as on an AR-15. And then the safety is basically the same place, and it is a 90-degree throw. And it is also swappable. There's a little indicator on the other side, and that's just so that you can turn it sideways, be able to check your chamber area, and then also see if it's on safer fire without having to actually look at the other side, which is kind of nice. But you can actually swap that component out if you need to for lefties. And so those controls are fairly conventional. Of course, the trigger guard, you'll notice, is very unconventional. A lot of people replace these. I personally don't find it to be any major issue. I still have a fairly natural place to rest my trigger finger. The grip itself doesn't feel bad. Some people don't like it, but that's going to be personal preference. Doesn't feel bad to me. That's okay. And then as far as mounting options, the gun is kind of scrunched up. Bullpups are like that. But you still have a lot of the same mounting options that you would on an AR-15 platform. The gun comes with these little covers on it, but these covers can be taken off. And you got, if I can get it to come off, yep. But yeah, they just slide. Takes a little bit of doing, but it's not bad. And underneath those little covers, they'll have 1913 Picatinny rail there, and that's what I've done on the bottom is I took off the cover that was there and put a folding vertical foregrip on it. And so you can still attach lights onto either side. You can still attach your foregrips on it and those kinds of things. Pretty much anything that you would do with an AR-15, especially one that you was set up as your bedside gun, you could easily do with this. Now, with that being said, there is one caveat, and that the rail, the top rail, I personally don't like its height. It's just not very convenient for mounting optics. Now, it does come with some pop-up sights that are integrated into the gun itself, and they, of course, fold down into the top rail. And these sights actually work real well. I don't like using those kinds of sights, especially at night. I don't like them on home defense guns, which is what this is, just because you have to line up the sights and then get it on target, and there's just one more step in there in the aiming process. Not that it takes a whole lot of time, but just anything that I can do to simplify I like, and so red dot sight is usually much quicker target acquisition, at least for me. But as far as the mechanics of it, is how accurate they are or not, these pop-up sights are just fine, and they're very much so like conventional AR-15 sights. One thing that is a little bit different about it is that your windage and elevation adjustment is all on the front sight. The rear sight is basically just a little peephole, but the front sight is where you're going to have both your windage adjustment and your elevation adjustment, and it has little indicators on it as to which way you're to turn what and those kinds of things. It comes with a little tool that you can use to get in there if you need to. But good pop-up sights that way. But like I said, I usually use optics of one form or another, because this is my home defense gun, and I especially like red dots, as you can see. But the problem that I have is that the red dot, if I want to get a center center my red dot in my sight, my head kind of bobbles a little bit. It'd be nice to get a little bit lower hold on it, which is where the pop-up sights are. They're a little bit lower. But whenever I mount the red dot on these things, on any kind of Tavor, and even on a lot of other guns too, but especially on Tavors, it's really hard to find the right height for what I want. And this one's a little bit off from what I want. It's just sitting a little bit too high and my head still kind of bobbles around. Now you can of course get other mounts, and sometimes you can find mounts that are just a little bit shorter and whatnot, but I wanted a quick detachable mount system, and that's why it has the thumb screws on it. And finding a quick detachable mount that is the right height is almost impossible with these things. It's just not good. It's not quite the standard AR height, and so a lot of the mounting options that are made for ARs are just a little bit too tall. Same thing with this one. If this was an AR, this would probably be okay, but it's not an AR, and the way that works is just a little bit different, and so it's just a little bit off. And with a lot of red dots, if you change the position of your head relative to the dot, you will change your point of impact just a little bit, and so that can result in some inconsistency of shots. Now over short distances, what this thing was made for is basically made for close quarter interdictions and those kinds of things. Over close ranges, yeah, it's not a huge issue. But if you're trying to line up, a 100-yard shot, and your head's sitting there bobbling on it, and you're changing your point of impact ever so slightly with it, that could be an issue. It's certainly annoying at the very least, I'll certainly say that. On the pluses, now getting back to the pluses, this does have some pretty good mounting options for slings. At the front, it has some mounting points on both sides. And then at the rear, it has some mounting points, and you'll see I actually have a ring mount in there, but it has that mounting option on the opposite side as well. And then this upper ring can actually be swapped out to the other side, and so that works pretty well. And so in terms of being able to put a sling on it, it's actually pretty good. You have, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different points where you could put slings or sling mounts, and so it's pretty good that way. And that's what I like about a lot of Bullpup designs. A lot of Bullpups actually do have quite a few mounting options on them. And so going from an AR-15 platform to a lot of Bullpups as far as mounting options are concerned for your slings work pretty well with them actually. Not that I use a sling on this all that much, because it's my bedside gun, and so I don't really feel too much of a need to use a sling. Some people like slings for bedside guns. For me, it's just one more thing to have to worry about in an already stressful situation, and the fewer things the better for me. But other people, they like the idea of putting the sling on because it makes it harder for the gun to get taken away from them, and I understand that, but speed of response is a little bit more important to me, and so having one less thing to worry about makes sense to me. Alright, so that covers most of the ergonomic features and the mounting features and those kinds of things. While I'm at it, as to externals, I'll go ahead and talk about this. This is a compensator that it comes with. And when it comes to 9mm guns, I am not a fan of compensators. And for those of you who don't know what the concept is, the idea, especially with military guns, is that you're firing, and of course there's going to be recoil that pushes back, and because of how the barrel sits relative to your shoulder, it tends to push the gun up. And in a military application, you can run full auto, and so it's round after round after round after round in very rapid succession, and it's going to be pushing back the entire time. It's going to be pushing up the entire time. And so what you have with some folks is they'll start firing in full auto, and the gun will get away from them. It'll start flying upward and do all kinds of weird things, and they lose control of the gun, and it shoots things that they did not intend to shoot, and that's obviously not good. And so what a lot of militaries have taken to doing is they put compensators on the end. And this is not just a normal flash suppressor, although this one does function as a flash suppressor too. But what happens is they limit the amount of gas that can escape out of the bottom. You'll see this one's completely closed off on the bottom. And then the top, they leave holes there. So what happens is gas is coming off the top, no gas is coming off the bottom, so that's so the resultant force is only going one way. Gas is coming up, it's going to push the barrel down. So what would normally be, whoa, I can't control it, it keeps pushing it down every time it comes out. So you get a little bit of recoil trying to push back, but those gases coming out at the end are going to push on the barrel a little bit too and help keep it more or less level. That's the theory, and for full auto military guns, it's great. For civilian guns though, and especially something as low powered as 9mm, 9mm is not overly powerful at all. For a low powered civilian gun that's not going to be running in full auto, in my opinion, and different people have different opinions based on their own experiences and those kinds of things, but in my experience, these things just do more to get in the way than anything else. This thing isn't a full auto, so it's only going to fire when you press the trigger. And so you fire, and normally you get a little bit of pushback and just a little bit of barrel rise. It's a 9mm, it's not overly powerful. And then you just naturally let it fall back into place, you're back on target, and you can shoot again and be able to do a fairly quick follow-up shot if you didn't have a compensator on there. But since this has a compensator on there, what's going to happen is you're going to fire, and it's not a very powerful cartridge in the first place, so it's not going to want to push up all that much, but there will still be a fair amount of gas coming out the end that's going to push it down. And so instead of just a normal impulse, instead it bounces a little bit, and it actually takes longer to get back on target. And some of the guns that are out there, and this is something I find frequently with 9mm carbines. 9mm carbines, a lot of manufacturers out there love to put compensators on the end, and some of them a lot more aggressive than this one. This one's actually a fairly moderate compared to some compensators that are out there. But they'll put compensators on their 9mm carbines all the time, and all that it does is it just makes the gun really bouncy and really hard to get a good solid shot with. Now this gun is fairly heavy. This is the civilian version, of course, of the military version, and for the civilian versions they have to make them a little bit bigger. You can't have the fun full auto in there. And all of those changes, having to be bigger means you have a longer barrel, there's weight added there. Of course, the rail system on it is going to be a little bit longer as well. That adds weight, and this one winds up being about 8 pounds without anything on it. That's the stock configuration, is an 8-pound gun, which is pretty heavy. And this one only fires 9mm. 9mm out of an 8-pound gun, that's not bad. Typically the way that it works is that the heavier gun, the lighter the felt recoil. 8 pounds is pretty heavy for most guns, especially for 9mm guns, because most 9mm guns that you would think of are typically handguns, and those usually don't weigh more than a couple pounds. This is like 4 times that. It's very controllable. Okay, the compensator on the end, all that does is it extends the time that you're going to be off target between shots. That's all that it winds up doing in the end. So for me, what I found works best for a lot of my carbines is to take the stupid compensator off and then just buy a barrel nut to replace it. Now, like I said, this one is a fairly heavy gun, and this is a relatively mild compensator that's on the end of this one, and so I don't worry about it this much with this particular gun. But with my 9mm carbines in general, there's a lot of them that I would just yank the compensator off. Usually all it takes is just a wrench. Take the compensator off, put a good barrel nut on there, call it good. And a lot of carbines that are out there as far as getting a barrel nut for them are 1/2 by 28 for 9mm. This one is a little bit different. The Tavors they did kind of a weird thing when it came to the 9mm. Instead of 1/2 by 28, they went 1/2 by 36. So just be aware of that. They do sell barrel nuts for it, but it's 1/2 by 36 instead of 1/2 by 28. So that's most of the external features that I wanted to talk about. Now, internally, the Tavors are very interesting. The X95 series, they decided to make it into a multi-caliber platform. So basically, the externals of the gun stay exactly the same, but you can open it up and you can swap out all the main components. You can swap out the barrel for different caliber sizes. You can change out the gas system to different configurations, because this thing comes in 5.56, it also comes in 300 blackout, and of course 9mm, which I have. You can get different bolts for it, and then of course different magazine well inserts. For the 5.56 and the 300 blackout, it's basically the normal magazine insert, but for 9mm you have to change it around because it uses a smaller mag. And for 5.56 and 300 blackout, it uses just standard AR-15 magazines. In the 9mm conversion, you can get the IWI magazines, which is what this one is here. Help if I have the logo right. IWI magazine, but the Colt 9mm magazines also work in it just fine. Where I am, the IWI magazines are actually cheaper. I can usually get these for about 30 bucks a piece. Whereas the Colt magazines in my area, I usually have to pay like 60 bucks a piece. So I just do the IWI ones. They're cheaper for me. But the internals, like I said, you can swap out for all those things. So it's the same chassis, same controls, all that stuff, but you're switching out the internals. And from a marketing perspective, that actually made a lot of sense for IWI to do that, because a lot of their sales will go to law enforcement and government agencies. Agencies that aren't necessarily interested in having full auto weapons. This is the civilian version, it's not full auto. But they still want something that's relatively small because they have to work in homes as well and around tight spaces and whatnot. So they want something that's going to work well in close quarters. And a concern that they have is they want to have the availability of having very effective rounds for when they actually need to go out and do something to take care of a bad guy. But when it comes to practice, they don't necessarily want to have to shoot the expensive rounds all the time. So the idea behind having all these different caliber conversions that the X95 has was to have the same platform that would have the same controls every single time, but you'd basically have your trainer versions that would be like 9mm or 5.56, and then your active duty versions that would be like 300 blackout or 5.56. The 9mm was designed primarily to be the training version of the other ones. It's not like it's ineffective, but it works. But that was the idea, is to have the same platform, same controls, same feel every single time, but be able to run different calibers out of it. And in that regard, it was actually a really cool idea. And I'll go ahead and show you how the field strip on this thing works. Now, I think I've already mentioned before that back here is where the sear pack is, and you can just push on these two little pins here, and they're retained, and so you just kind of pull them out to the stop point, and then you can take the sear pack out and clean in there if you need to. But for most of the time, you don't need to worry about that. The only thing that you really need to worry about most of the time is just the pin that's up here. So this one I can just push with my finger, and I've had this gun for a while, and so it's kind of worn out. When I first got it, I usually had to take something and push it all the way through, but now it's worn to the point where I don't have to worry about it anymore. And it is a retained pin, it stays there just fine. And then the butt pad comes open, and then inside is the 9mm blowback bolt, and it is a beefy bolt. And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this bolt. It is very sturdy, very durable. I've not had any major issues in that regard. There was one point where I was having some reliability issues with the Tavor, with this gun, but it turns out it wasn't anything innate to the gun. It turns out the fault was with me. I'd gotten the wrong kind of oil for the gun, and you put the wrong kind of oil in it, it's going to do weird things. I'd got some of the quick release oil, which isn't really oil, it's just basically an anti-seize that's not really even a lubricant. It's basically just an anti-seize liquid, and I made the mistake of thinking that it was gun oil, which it wasn't, and so I put it throughout the gun. And the anti-seize stuff, which is really great for loosening things that have become stuck, the problem is that that anti-seize stuff will dry out. It's not meant to be put on the gun and just left in the gun. It's just used for loosening things up that need to be loosened up in the field, and it's not meant to be left on the gun. After you get the gun loosened up and doing what you want it to do, you need to take it home and clean it and do maintenance on it. But I confused it for regular gun oil, put it all throughout the gun, and the thing seized up because it dried out. And it's not what it was designed for, and then I had some reliability issues that way. But if you actually use regular gun oil and it doesn't require anything fancy, just not that weird anti-seize stuff, it runs just fine in pretty much anything that I've put through it. Sometimes it doesn't do real well with super light bullets, but that's true of most blowback designs in general. Blowback is, of course, inertia dependent, momentum dependent, and so they tend to do better with a little bit heavier loads rather than lighter ones. It still runs the 115s just fine, but if you're going to go lighter than 115, you just be advised that it might not work as reliably. But with 115 grain and up, super reliable. Like I said, as long as I didn't do something stupid to it, it's fed everything that I've put into it, been completely reliable that way. But the love-hate relationship that I have with the bolt itself is the way that it's designed. Let's see if I can show this to you guys. The bolt is actually designed so that you can take it apart and swap it out for left-handed use. And so you'll see a couple of openings on it. One of the openings has the extractor for the bolts in it, and the other side just kind of has a little pin that's stuck in there that acts as a filler. Well, it turns out that with a set of punches and a few other things, you can actually take apart some of the different pieces on it, and you can actually take out the extractor, you can take out the little plug that's in the other side and swap them around to convert this into a left-handed bolt so it ejects out the other side. And of course the receiver on the gun itself is also made so that you can close one port and open up the other one. And so this is a gun that, provided you had a few basic gunsmithing tools at your disposal, you know, a punch set and a hammer set, you could actually convert it over to being a left-handed gun in your own home. Now this doesn't work with all of the Tavors, this is just the 9mm version. With the 5.56 and the 300 blackout versions, you actually need to get a different bolt. This bolt, though, they designed to be something that you can take apart and you can swap over, which is great for being able to work on it at home. The problem, though, is that since everything is basically doubled up, you have twice as many nooks and crannies that you have to clean. So every time you have to clean this thing, it's kind of a major chore. I don't like this bolt in that regard. This bolt is a pain to clean. Very reliable, very effective. It's nice that you can swap it out if you're a left-handed person, so you can get left-handed ejection versus right. But all these extra crooks and crevices that you have throughout it, because everything's doubled, well, basically means that you wind up taking twice as much time to clean the thing as you normally would. And so that is a little bit of a disadvantage. But overall, a very reliable system. Is just kind of a pain to clean. And then while we're on talking about it being a pain to clean, let's talk about that receiver. The receiver in there is fairly long, and it's fairly narrow. Now, if you get the 5.56 version of this gun, it actually has a receiver brush that fills the whole thing, and you just, you know, put the cleaning solvent and whatnot on it, and the oil when it's time for that, and just run it through the receiver, and it's good. But if you get the 9mm version like I did, it doesn't come with the receiver brush, which means you're usually stuck with getting a toothbrush or a nylon gun cleaning brush or whatever, and trying to work around all the nooks and crevices and trying to get in there. And it's doable with a lot of the standard nylon brushes, but it's not overly pleasant, for sure, and it is kind of long. And so far I have not found a really optimally lengthed gun cleaning brush for this gun. Like I said, if you get the 5.56 version, it actually comes with a receiver brush. Nice big poofy thing that actually fills out the thing quite well and does great. 9mm version doesn't come with that, so you're stuck trying to poke in there and do weird things. And so to clean, it's a relatively simple takedown. It's just, you know, open up the back end, pull out the bolt. That part of it is simple, but actually physically cleaning the things is a little bit difficult. You have a two-sided bolt. It takes basically twice as much time to clean. And then the receiver is long and narrow, and so that's going to take some extra care and attention. But still relatively simple, especially compared to some guns. A gun that only has two main parts to it to clean, I'm definitely okay with that. And I am kind of nitpicking at this point, I admit, because normally that wouldn't be that big of a thing. There we go. And then to close it, of course, you put the bolt back in just like I did, and you do have to kind of line it up a little bit, but it's not too terribly difficult. Push on the butt pad, and while you're pushing on the butt pad, push the pin through. Good to go. Not overly complicated or very difficult at all. I like it a lot in that regard. So that's basically the features that you need to be aware of. In terms of accuracy, like I said, it's not great, and the 9mm version certainly isn't a whole lot better. I would tell you what my accuracy is with it, but I'm not overly accurate in the first place, and so that wouldn't give you guys a very good comparison. But people that I've had that have shot it, kind of once they figure out where it's shooting, and one of the big problems that you have is that if you put an optic on it of any kind, it usually winds up being mounted just a little too high for what's comfortable for a good cheek well. But it's also pretty high off of the bore axis. There's about a 4-inch difference between the barrel and the center line of the barrel and the center line of the sight. And so, depending on where you have this thing zeroed, you can be up to 4 inches off of where the sight actually says that you are. And so it can take a little bit to figure out exactly where it is. I usually censor these kinds of guns that are meant for use in close quarters. I usually zero these guns at somewhere between 25 and 50 yards. And then anything in front of that, which is mostly what you'd get in close quarter situation, the point of impact is going to be below the point of sight, which means you have a hanging impact zone. And it's very common in military applications. You basically aim at the top of your target and it's going to hit somewhere below that. And not to be too grotesque, but when you're talking about 9mm, if you want to be combat effective, you're usually not talking about center of mass shots, you're usually talking about headshots. And so common military application with a gun like this, especially with the sights being so far off, is you'll aim basically at the top of the head, and then your impact is going to be somewhere where you need it to be. It works fairly well in that regard. Does what it's supposed to do, but it is weird for some people to get a hold of if you're not used to kind of a normal hunting rifle, or even just a 1022 or something like that, where the sights are relatively close to the bore axis. You don't have a problem with it being too far off, especially at relatively close ranges. Usually no more than a couple inches. Like I said, this thing's a full 4 inches off. And so depending on how you have it sighted in and whatnot, it can be a little hard to figure out exactly where it's hitting. But like I said, I usually sight these kinds of guns in at somewhere between 25 and 50 yards, and then just have it hanging at points of impact, so aim at the top of the target and you'll hit somewhere below. And that's kind of what they're designed for, and that's very common military application for these kinds of things. Not that this is a true military gun, but you know, that's the way it goes. Okay, then last but not least, is this the gun for you? Ultimately, I can't answer that for you because I'm not you. But what I can say is that a lot of people are probably going to be better served by a more conventional rifle style, so like an AR-15 or something like that, that has more accessible parts, those kinds of things. People who work on Tavors are relatively few and far between, versus people who know the AR platform. They're all over the place. And then AR-15s are definitely longer guns, especially in the civilian version, but most people can make them work even in relatively tight spaces. Not optimally, but they can make them work. And then they also have the AR-15 pistols that are out now and those kinds of things. And just having the more powerful round, which does actually have less over-penetration risk than normal pistols and whatnot, a lot of people are going to be better served by that. So what kind of people would be interested in something like this, especially in 9mm version? First of all, people who are interested in being able to shoot a little bit more cheaply. Okay, if you're like me and I go shooting fairly often, that difference, even though it's not a huge difference, that difference in expense can start to rack up. And yeah, like I said, it's only like 4 or 5 cents difference per round, but when you're talking about shooting, you know, 100 rounds minimum each time that you go out, that can add up pretty quickly. And if your self-defense needs are relatively low, you don't anticipate anything major happening, you just want to have something in case, then that can be useful. And then, like I said, this is a relatively small gun, and so if you find yourself in relatively cramped quarters fairly often and you have really weird angles to work around, then something that's really small but still has that full-length barrel on it to give you as much ballistic performance as you can get without having to go into NFA, SBR, $200 tax stamp area could be a good thing for you. But like I said, for most people, this really isn't going to be a good gun for them. And I'm not saying that it isn't a good gun. I love it. It suits my needs real well, and it's what I like. I do like bullpups. I do like the short, little maneuverable gun. I think it's cool. I like it. But just on a purely practical level, and especially considering the expense, because like I said, this is a $1,500 to $1,900 gun, at least in my area right now, brand new. Of course, you can get sales, and sometimes you can get them used considerably more cheaply, so on and so forth. But brand new, $1,500 to $1,900 is not a cheap gun. You can get a really nice AR-15 for that. In fact, depending on the sale and depending on which AR-15 platform gun you're looking at, sometimes you could get about 2 AR-15s for the price of this. It makes justifying this a lot harder. Like I said, I like this, and that's the primary reason why I have this. But on a practical level, it's not the most practical gun that's out there. I'm recoil sensitive, and so I like lower powered rounds. That's part of it. I'm also a little bit of a cheapskate. I like to go shooting a whole lot, and I don't want to have to pay any more than I have to, so the cheaper round is nice. But for most people, it's going to be very cost inefficient. A lot of people will be much better served with an AR-15. Even one of the AR-15 pistols, for a lot of people, as long as they get a decent quality one, is going to be better than something like this. I do like the fact that the added barrel on this one does really amp up the performance of the 9mm quite a bit. Like I said, it's about a 40% difference in kinetic energy. That's cool. But if you're talking 5.56 or 300 blackout, not so great. That's kind of a different story. But yeah, in general, not what I would recommend for most people. It's expensive. It's not overly accurate. There are some parts of it that are interchangeable with systems that are common that are out there. I mean, it has pick rail on it. If you get the 5.56 version, it takes standard AR-15 magazines. Those kinds of things are all fairly interchangeable. But like I said, it's expensive, and if you're talking about the 9mm version that I have here, it doesn't really play all that well with other things. It's not super interchangeable. Like I said, it's kind of expensive for what it is. About the only advantage that it has is that it's relatively short, without having to get into any special NFA territory or anything like that. And people talk about the braced pistols and things like that, and that might be an option for some people. I personally don't like the braced pistols because you usually wind up with a considerably shorter barrel, which can inhibit ballistic performance depending on the type of round that you're talking about. Sometimes it increases it, but sometimes it decreases it. And then, of course, the braced pistols have the brace on there, which isn't a proper stock, and they usually wind up being really short if you try to use them as a stock. And the NFA kind of goes back and forth depending on the moment as to whether or not you are or are not supposed to do that. And the NFA in general just doesn't like the braced pistols all that much, and their rulings, like I said, they wobble around. And I don't like the braced pistols. I don't find them very comfortable just because they are kind of scrunched. And then there can be just practical problems with them in terms of reliability if you're talking about the rifle caliber ones. The pistol caliber ones tend to be a lot better in terms of reliability, but you could get a Bullpup in 5.56 and be about the same size and actually have a full-length barrel on it, and but that teach their own on that one. But overall, for most people, I would say no. For me, I happen to like the gun. I like bullpups. I like 9mm, and this is about like the only bullpup 9mm that I know that's out there that's at least somewhat commonly available.
And so that kind of meant this was the only one for me. But for most people that are looking for good bang for their buck and not just something that's fun and cool, probably don't want to go this way. But if you do want something that's 9mm and it's fun and cool, hey, knock yourself out. If you got the money for it, great. This I got with tax return money, you know. But normally, not what I would spend my money on. But I do like it. And like I said, it's been very reliable for me as long as I actually put the right kind of oil in it. And absolute pleasure to shoot. And I do plan on taking off that compensator here very quickly and make it even more pleasurable to shoot. But for most people, probably not what you want. Okay, the problems with the trigger pull, the problems with cleaning it can be kind of annoying, especially just for something that's 9mm. And then, you know, just the overall kind of quirkiness of it, that bolt release being something that's pretty easily hit if you're not careful. All of those mean that on the practical level, for most people, it's not the gun for them. But I like it, nonetheless. And as far as cool guns are concerned, that's cool. I absolutely love it in that regard, but I'm also not blind to the fact that you can do a lot of the same things more effectively with more conventional systems that are also a lot cheaper as far as the gun themselves are concerned. And even if you wanted to stick with 9mm, there's lots of 9mm carbines out there that you're going to get fairly similar results out of. For example, as a good competitive option, there is the Ruger PC carbine that's out now, and they do make them in 9mm primarily. I don't know if they have any plans to do any other caliber conversions, but right now 9mm. And they make them so that they can take Glock mags, and of course if you're taking Glock mags, well, Glock mags come in all kinds of configurations now, or at least things that are compatible with Glock are in all kinds of configurations now, so you can get pretty much any magazine size that you want. And the Ruger PC carbine is like $500 to $600 most of the time, at least in my area right now. And it's still a relatively short gun, fairly conventional platform that most people would be used to. The line of sight versus the bore axis are closer together. It takes optics much more readily without having the issue of it being a little too high or just a little too low, like that one does. And so for people that are looking for a practical 9mm carbine to get into for relatively cheaply, I would really strongly recommend the Ruger PC carbine. But I still like that thing better. But just being practical, maybe not so much. Alright, so that is the gun, the run through on it. Kind of the philosophy behind it is a close quarters gun that still has full ballistic performance, but usually not much of anything else. Relatively simple field strip, but because it's made to be lefty convertible, it kind of is a little bit more difficult to clean. It has a very long receiver as well that's difficult to clean. So it's kind of a quirky gun. But for people that have used it, and especially that have used it regularly, they get used to it. And there's something that is just kind of endearing about the gun. It's a fun gun to walk around the apartment with it and just kind of in the crook of my arm. You know, and I can go through pretty much all the doorways like this without having to worry about the barrel hitting something on it and all those kinds of things. It's just a fun, cool gun. But in terms of cost effectiveness and also in terms of ballistic performance, there are other things out there that will be better. Alright, so that's my opinion on it. I absolutely love the thing. It was my very first 9mm rifle ever, and still working just fine to this day, as long as I stay away from that quick release stuff that wasn't really true gun oil. As long as I actually use real gun oil on it and keep it, you know, relatively clean. It doesn't have to be super clean to run, but just have that stuff that dries out and gets gooey and gunky in there. As long as you don't fill it with sludge, basically, just fine. So like I said, for me it's great, but I'm not going to make the argument that it will be the best gun for everybody, because it isn't. But for me it's great. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I know that this one got kind of long, but hopefully you found it interesting and you were able to discover some things about the platform that maybe you didn't know about before, and also be able to go into it with realistic expectations. And I think that's important. There are guns that we buy just simply because we like them, and that's fine. And as long as it's decently reliable and doesn't cause you too much headaches, good. If you've got the spare money for it, great. But I don't want you thinking that this is the meet-all, be-all, and that it's so superior to everything else just because it's a bullpup. That's not how bullpups work. All that you gain with a bullpup is that it's shorter. That's pretty much it. In every other category, bullpups are usually worse. They're not as accurate. The triggers are tend to be rather heavy and kind of spongy. The cleaning them is usually a little bit of a pain. Mounting optics on them, finding the right height for the optics to get it to do what you do, sometimes takes a little bit of finessing and finagling. Just lots of things that make them not quite as optimal as we would prefer. But you do have full-length barrel and a relatively short package, and that's exactly what they were meant to do, and that they do well. Thank you guys for your time and attention. Bye-bye.